Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 73, and the topic is the future of AuthZ from A to Z. Our guests today are Rohit Kaur, a computer scientist trying to make identity and access management easier and more effective, and a former Google product manager. And our co-host or co-guest today is Alex Olivier, co-founder and chief product officer of Cerbos. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real treat,
maybe
man.
we could
Your
start.
work.
Yes. And so maybe we could start with some quick intros. Alex, why don't we start with you, and then we'll introduce Rohit. Alex, how did you find yourself as chief product officer of an authorization company?
Good question. So I started out in a more of a technical consulting kind of background. I was at Microsoft doing all sorts of crazy stuff on the .NET stack and working with large finance institutions and like the NHS here in the UK, the health service, and kind of started running into these kind of access permissions, IAM style type problems. Realized maybe enterprise companies wasn't quite right for me at that stage of my career, and then moved into a few different startups where I really was predominantly an engineer for a couple of years, building SaaS platforms for e-commerce, marketing technology stack. Did some pieces around finance, connected fitness, supply chain even. But one of the commonalities I kept having to kind of architect both initially as an engineer and then later as a product manager for defining the requirements was this sort of permissions authorization type challenge. And this was five or so years ago now. And every single time we were building it inside of the various companies I was at, we were getting annoyed. Like, why are we wasting another 3, 6, 12 months building out this authorization system? Why isn't there just an off-the-shelf system that we could bring in and drop into place? So when we do sign that next enterprise customer with all sorts of weird and wonderful type access models that they demand, we don't have to go and re-engineer the product. So after running into that problem nearly a dozen times with a couple of my previous colleagues, we founded Cerbos coming up to 4 years ago now to do exactly that and kind of solve a pain we had ourselves from the more of the kind of practitioner side of things of implementing predominantly SaaS platforms that needed much more fine-grained permissions than was possible using just JOTs and those sort of things.
And you guys are doing amazing. The project has like 3,000 plus stars, lots of downloads, lots of excitement, and the best logo in the authorization industry, I think.
I can't take any credit for that, but it's people certainly seem to like it and enjoy our stickers.
It's my favorite AuthZ t-shirt, actually, by far.
Did you not make plushies of it?
We do have plushies of it. I haven't actually got one to hand.
Plushies, they're awesome.
Yeah, I've just come back from Gartner IM and I was giving out plushies, so I'm all out. But yes, we do have plushies.
I have to say, I really have fun being part of this particular industry. I know AuthZ is a small sort of segment of the market, but it's really great, I think, how, in the academia, if your academic specialty is so small, there's no one else to talk to. You can't have a conference. And I feel like authorization, we've just gotten enough people, so we have enough people where we can get together and like have a conference and talk about stuff.
Absolutely.
So we're hitting critical mass. Rohit, why don't you tell us, before we dive into the A to Z presentation, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you found your way to this topic?
It's a little pointed. I mean, one of the things I'm currently interested in is seeing if we can indeed have a conference about this space. That's how I got this newsletter. It's how we've gone in touch a lot of you folks recently on authorization weekly clipping service. It's been a little less weekly of late. Let me tell you, my story goes a couple places. Why don't you pull up that screen there? It's a very quick intro slideshow I've got.
Okay, so we're doing, I just want to mention to the audience that this is the first time we're doing like a screen share from a guest. So,
and don't worry, I'll try to narrate along for the podcast.
Breaking new ground.
It's just a funny shot of me and my family, but obviously you work in a large company, and you'll see in a second, I spent about after they acquired one of my startups, and you do a lot of places where you introduce yourself as a product manager. And it's just me and the family on the beach. But I point out that, who is this guy? And I call myself sometimes the Forrest Gump of the web, or a middle-aged child prodigy, but I've had some good luck. I've had an interesting now almost 30 years in the industry. I'd gotten a chance to work for 2 Nobel Prize winning labs, got a chance to work for two Turing Award winners. I got a Wikipedia entry. It's probably one that if I ever touch it or manage it, will probably immediately get marked as not notable. So I'm kind of afraid to update it. But during that years at Google, I sold a natural language startup called Angstro to what became Google Plus, for those of you who are old enough. But I had the chance to work in the early cloud on commercializing Google Translate as an AI product, on creating Google Cloud PubSub. That's very into that later, but that's a case of sometimes you get the chance to do that first startup again, and now 20 years later, it's a very, very significant business. Working IoT on cloud machine learning. My most role there was helping launch Napa. It's our new exabyte scale database data warehouse. So much exciting stuff going on now at that scale finally. But the relevant part for here was that I was product manager for, you can switch back off the video, for Google Cloud IAM for a little while. And these were hats that are pretty old, but this hat was made non-ironically back before the election. Not
What
this
does it
election,
say? I'm sorry, I'm old
before
and
that
my
one.
eyes are
But it
small.
says, "Make IAM great again."
Oh no.
As the
That's as close as we get to politics on this show.
But I pointed out that it was because another PM on the team had made some for our API stack team that I worked with, the gRPC spec. One of those many Forrest Gump moments was that I also had a chance to work on the REST architectural style. That was my office mate at UC Irvine, where I did my PhD. I got to work on a lot of early web standards. C teams, make RPC great again. And then one of the other TLs on my team decided that'd be great. But they ordered the hats, but they arrived after the election with Donald Trump. And I said, these are going to land a little differently as swag goes. And little do we know. But in particular, one of the logos on there was for Forseti open source. And I had the first time ever launched a product with cloud security and for Google Cloud Platform security. But at that point, we had 1,000 different permissions in cloud you could turn on and off independently. And I said, this is a product that we're shipping that's almost too complicated for users. And it was the first time we did a launch memo that said, yay, it's not up and to the right. Our usage level is solid. We've been at this for a while. The good news is that only a small percentage of our customers are using it. The better news is they represent the majority of our revenue, because it is essential for our biggest enterprise customers to have a system that works very fine-grained, very least privileged, with lots of knobs and dials. It's the simple question, who could delete this bucket? And that was one of the other things I'm proudest of, is much shipping for Cloud IAM, but actually of shipping a little open source utility at the time that was called IAM Explain. Who could delete this bucket? And it was kind of written in Prolog by one of our engineers. And that was the thing that stuck with me. So a couple of years later, as things happened, sorry to go with the longer bio, but it's a little relevant here to why I got into authorization. It had been nagging me that the whole industry was getting more and more complicated all the time. And I was always on the lookout for who's going to be the team that helps invent ways to make natural language policies, how to make policy assistants, or now co-pilots, how to generally allow people to run closer to least privileged than they do right now. And I got involved in a series of startups after leaving Google. And after this last one, helped work with the Cedar team to start this newsletter. It's been a great year. Sorry for the running on, but that's a little bit of how I got here.
It's a lot of work. Normally I'd pivot to Alex to say a couple of words, but I think, Alex, sorry, we're going to let Rohit go straight into the presentation, and then we'll start hassling him after that. So this is a presentation that I saw in, I think, an IAW session. And Alex has also saw it briefly at IAW, I think, too.
Yep.
But it's just sort of a fun session. Well, I don't want to ruin it. Rohit, you want to dive into it? And are you going to share your screen for this?
I believe I am. Is it currently showing
you are? Okay, as long as I turn it on. Yes.
Great. Well, this was, interwoven in this, since I don't know what our audience is, and I hope that you're keeping an eye a bit on YouTube live. Sometimes I left questions there. I don't know if we have much of an interactive audience here.
Okay, I see a question in the live stream already. We don't generally take questions from the audience. I know you sometimes throw questions at us. I try and listen to the guests, and I get distracted.
I thought I'd ask if you think
if we see any good ones here, I can actually pop them up. See, I can see it pop that one up.
Okay. A good one to start on.
That is a.
But
let's keep going.
Yeah, but we can address them afterwards too. So if people, I love the conversation, and it's a good chance for us because a lot of people watch this after the fact anyway. So the LinkedIn
Always
page
interact.
of the video is a good place to have that conversation. And the audience is identity architects, identity engineers, and other cybersecurity sort of specialists is the audience.
Well, then I'll play it straight. Let's take at it. A couple of months ago, there's a team at the Internal Revenue Service that was having an offsite trying to figure out how to reinvent the future of authorization for a whole bunch of legacy systems. And I came in and just give a quick invited pep talk. And I thought this is based on the volunteers who help run the authz.substack.com newsletter.
Uh-huh.
And I thought I'd summarize what is it I've learned so far in the last year. And that's about this future of this AuthZ market, why it's different from the AuthN market. And we'll plunge right in. So we talk about the fact that the SSO tax is finally happening, right? We have these websites that complain about why is it for a SaaS application, I have to pay extra so that I can sign in, not with my own personal ID, but sign in with my corporate employee login. And I just felt like I should step back and say, if death and taxes are inevitable, the SSO tax is something to be really proud of. It's really amazing that we finally got like between 25 to 40 years it's taken us to the point where most apps that you write hello world, you are so-and-so name, that you can use single sign-on. It's been a long journey going back to the beginnings of Kerberos to be able to have single sign-on working well. So that means that, of course, if I don't have to roll my own password and username system, but every time you do finish signing in, you end up rolling your own authorization system. Now, is that what we want? Right? I mean, when can you have some authorization standards where you say, just generally, interns shouldn't be having too much privileged access? So we'll talk about why.
I just want to, if I could just interrupt for a second there, Rohit. I want to, another one of the Authzenterati who we've had on the program is Or Weiss from Permit.io. And Or says something really interesting, which I love, which is that authorization wouldn't be possible without the standardization of authentication. So the standardizing the authn layer was sort of a precursor. If you launched an authorization company earlier, you couldn't have gotten traction. But the time is right now because we have this standardized authn layer. And to be honest, because it's OpenID Connect and OAuth. That is that auth, and not SAML. If you're using SAML, it's going to get bridged to an OpenID engine, and we're going to get an OpenID token. It's OpenID that's really the enabler for AuthZ, in my opinion, too. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So we're agreeing with you there. AuthN is the prereq, and now we can do AuthZ. And what is AuthZ you're saying, right?
Well, that's what I'll explain in a second. Although, spoiler alert, that's where AuthZ comes in at Z. So we'll see. So I'd like to say, if our problem was when you start Hello World and you want to say hello $user, you now have a standard to use for single sign-on. We're not even halfway there in terms of adoption, but it's a huge sight better than it ever was. If you now say, hello $user, you're an admin, and show them some buttons that only admins have, you're making an authorization decision, when will that get externalized? Why do we need it? And how long is it going to take? And so this talk briefly is in 3 parts. A little briefly about me. 2 is really what? Just facts, observations. That's the alphabet part about things we've learned from a year of collectively covering this emerging new industry of externalized AuthZ. And part 3 is definitely my opinions and what I conclude from it. So I'll skip right by that intro. But, I've been at this Riley book I wrote almost 25 years ago about trust management and formal inference of trust properties, e-commerce reviews. My dissertation work around 2003 was about decentralization, kind of before a lot of this blockchain and crypto stuff, but about this principle that the New York Stock Exchange is centralized. NASDAQ is a distributed quoting system, but foreign exchange is that real Wild West where there's no such thing as a true price of the yen-dollar exchange rate. It depends on which bank and how much you want to switch. And since then, we've been running this authorization clipping service. It was started a bit by Sarah Cicchetti and some of these other folks you'll know from the Okta ID 25 and that crew. And it's been running about every week now for about a year. We're in the middle of a survey. Please sign up and we'll come back to that. But the problems then start right there. So authorization is who can do what. A is for authorization, but you can't tell us with authorization everyone who could do something, whether there's someone who could do or everything I could do. So authorization systems are often, can user do this? They're not often able to answer these other hard questions about your security posture. Now, people ask, what's between AuthZ and AuthN? I say B is for Bond, James Bond. I'm not very afraid of him. not so mild-mannered guy. It's not until you see that he's got a license to kill and he's carrying a weapon that you should be worried, right? So Bond, not scary. License to kill, scary. AuthN, kind of not done, not hard to do. It's proud to know you, Mr. Bond. You should only be afraid when you know what they're authorized to do. And D is for deny. That's the default. So any authorization system is going to have default deny, and this is where you have these back. It was just no based access control. If there was no's, there would be no breaches or attacks. But the problem is the trade-off you should always look at this industry is super least privilege versus developer velocity. And it's always privilege and productivity. It's because one of those trade-offs is in error messages. E is for error. And often you want to say 404, not found. Maybe you don't even want to say it's forbidden, because I don't want to have any integration of whether you have an account on the system, whether this thing even existed. The GLOMAR, as the CIA says it, I will neither confirm nor deny. That helpful hint can be a problem. And yet, as a developer, the number one source of lead gen for us at some of these IAM startups have been involved in has been going in on forums and developers who are confused by an IAM error message. Could you just please explain this error?
Okay, could we put a pin in this for 1 second, and maybe I could ask Alex a question here?
Please do.
What's interesting is that, to say deny, well, that's interesting, but for developers, we really want to know why, so we can maybe remediate that. So the approved is like the good flow, and that's easy. It's the deny flow that's really important. I'm just curious, Alex, do you have any thoughts about how you handle that, about the trade-offs between releasing an error message but not releasing too much information?
Yeah, I mean, we always said that if developers around the world, there'll just be two user types. There'll be a developer who can do everything, or like the admin, and then users, and that's it. And it's a binary whether those actions are allowed or not. But when rubber meets the road, you have to do much more fine-grained things than that. And especially if you start building externalized platforms, things get a bit more complicated. Deny is definitely kind of an interesting case, and there's kind of different cases for deny as well that you need to start considering, because there's deny because they're trying to do something that doesn't exist. There's deny because there's a policy that says, that user with this particular group can't do it. Or there's a deny where it's deny but, where you want to kind of give some advice back to the application layer. So this is currently denied, but if they go and do a step-up authentication, for example, then that action would be allowed. So as kind of those, as you're working through and building out these systems, I think there's two types of errors and messaging to think about. One is what's returned to the application layer, and then the next one is what's returned to the user. And those things don't have to be the same thing. A lot of it that from a policy engine to the application layer, you can be very explicit and start giving advice for what the application needs to do. But then when you start doing the external message, then you need to be a bit more careful of by saying a deny, you're basically implicitly applying that maybe that resource exists versus just 404 not found, therefore you can't make any assumptions about the system. So I think it's very much kind of a two-step sort of deny what you say to the system and then what you say to the end user that you need to think about. And yes, sudo, make me a sandwich.
There's a little bit of art versus science here. Like there's no right answer about what exactly to return. Anyway, sorry, Rohit.
I was just sub XKCDing Alex's answer with
exactly.
Right. Yes, developers, there's just me. You should be all powerful and just do root anytime they want, and end users who know nothing. But in fact, part of what makes this hard is that you want to offer a smarter system. It is 2025, all this copilot and assistance. Why can't we get advice on saying you developer best path to get there? Well, guess what? There may be one reason when you get access and you're allowed, I don't care how. There might be three reasons you got it. But when you're denied, like, well, do you want to come root all the way to there? Or maybe you need to be added to this group. Or maybe you need to just relabel the machine prod and you'll have these productions, right? So doing the logic to say, here is the smallest surgical intervention that will get you the permission you need, hard question, right? That's an advice problem also about errors. I know Servos hub and policy editing, policy administration points. It's a good challenge. Just here's the proposed PR that will change your security posture so that you can get this. There's many ways to be denied, even if there's just one way to get approved. So, don't know if you're nodding along. I assume you can see that. Why do you agree with that problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we're cognizant of also letting you. We're only on E, so
Yeah.
we still have a lot of
No,
links.
don't worry.
So
They speed up.
my default
And I
position
will
is going to just be to let you roll.
But and this is where we get to exactly F is for formal methods, that logic to replace intuition with invariance. Because the intuition that says, why can't I look at these user traveler bookings and prod? And they say, you're an intern, and we have basic rules. An intern should look at PII in production systems. I'd rather write that down somewhere than go to figure out, well, why can't I look at this bucket, but that bucket has SQL files, but I can't hook it up to MySQL and actually look at those tables. Because I have no permission as an intern in cloud database product X, but I do have permission to look at the raw things. Or I can't look at the raw things, but I still look at all the constants, the backups. So it'd be better to go towards pre-crime. All right, if you're a Minority Report, I'd rather stop problems before they happen. And this automated reasoning team at Amazon is by far the leader. They're behind those little buttons like prevent anyone in my org from making an open bucket. And make sure that these things happen and get intercepted before they get misconfigured rather than reacting to them in a cron job a week later. So there's a famous paper here about access control lists don't, right? Because once you're down in the muck of having to see this truth table of who can access what, you're likely to miss something. You need to figure out what the higher order principles are. Zelkova now must be coming up on 8-9 years old, right? 2018. And yet, surprisingly, they seem to be the only one of the major cloud vendors really investing heavily in this. Slight pin, and I will pick up the pace here. 2 great news articles coming out of AWS reInvent under F here. One was during the keynote, they showed out a new kind of guardrail for Bedrock that uses formal reasoning to prevent, say, a customer service agent from offering a refund when policy doesn't allow it, because they have this extra say, no, logically that's a contradiction. You can't get that refund for that customer type or so on because of what you've explained. So natural language help in writing formal methods is going to be huge. And the other is that they've created a new kind of policy where you can author these pre-crime policies, resource policies. So we can come back to these invariants. Unless
Amazon has a formal reasoning team actually of academics. They call it, I think, under Amazon Science.
Yeah, Byron York's team has been so inspiring and yet uncopied for almost now a decade.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you this question about Google, because you know a little bit about Google. But someone asked me yesterday if every cloud vendor like Google and Microsoft are just going to come out with their own CEDAR.
Mm-hmm.
And they were sort of wondering, maybe it sounds like if they don't have a formal reasoning group, they probably are not going to get to something like a CEDAR.
I will be very clear. I left some years ago. Even then, I didn't speak for Google. It's impossible to do so. So all personal opinions here. The first part of the opinion is actually the quality of these people exists most everywhere. Like MSR, Poach, Microsoft Research has these folks, Google Research has these folks. The science of formal logic and AI is kind of a little bit in a bit of a shade of winter, maybe autumn, because all of the sunshine and hay is being made over in statistical methods and LLMs and generative AI. I think the synthesis of them, neurosymbolic systems is the keyword to keep an eye out for, is going to be hugely powerful. But I will say that I've not seen kind of announced projects like that quite yet at the other places. Amazon verified permissions remains the only major vendor-backed product for externalized auth out there that is on a par with the half dozen or so vendors we'll talk about here that work on the newsletter. So,
okay.
Yeah. Alex, I know not to slow down, but do you have some thoughts on the formal method?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, and I think there's this kind of bridge that maybe needs to be built a bit still between the pure maths, the pure formality of it, and then sort of the practicalities and realities of getting these sort of supported in a workflow that kind of marries both of those. I've met, I've had a chance to meet some of the AWS team that do the kind of research for this, and I felt about 5 PhD shorts to be qualified for that conversations. But then it's all about, that productization and how do you make these, a solid foundation to build upon. But you're absolutely right with, the sunshine being more on like the LLM world right now. And I think once the mindset has changed a bit around like model security and those kind of things, then that same sort of productization of these concepts, I think, can move into other areas such as authorization and the general like policy used across all the cloud providers.
That's great. So I'll come back to part 3 with my speculation on where this could go. It also reminds me of F is for Forrest Gump. I just am also really excited about this space because so many little people and folks I've met over the years are in this space. My undergrad TA is over at the automated reasoning team. Shout out to Rustam Lainal, who used to get MSR, or seeing that Neha Rungta, who's one of the heads on automated reasoning, is giving the keynote at the 2025 International Conference on Software Engineering, which is the highest honor in my little academic subworld. So,
is G going to be for glue?
We should make some room for that. This one is more personal habit, which is Git. G is for Git, or it didn't happen, right? Just like Git say Pix or it didn't happen. I think we need to move to a world in which AuthZ stuff is Git or it didn't happen. Policy administration points often use a database to store policies, but the revolution of DevSecOps makes a lot of sense. And security should be software too, just like software processes, and version control came out the first time. Git really solves a lot of problems here. I think that's something to come back to. One of the last projects I worked on, one of the was called Iambic, IAM, but in code too. H is for humans.
I know Git's important and everything, but I still think G should be for glue.
No, I'm fighting. I'm saying G should be for Git. Like, that was one of the core design principles we built with Cerbos at the beginning, was your policies should be version controlled. You should publish CI tooling. You should write tests against your policies that are run on every single commit, and it gives you that audit trail of exactly what happened.
That's the thing. The as code meme is really about do stuff like as Git, or
exactly
a VC of choice. I mean, we're lucky to live in a moment where it's so dominant. You and I have all lived through eras where there were 10 different popular version control systems, but any of them will do. All of them are better than letting people directly edit config files.
Exactly.
I had a call with a guy who is just started a new AuthZ company called PermGuard, an Italian guy, Nicolo, forgetting his Gallo, Nicolo Gallo. And he described the system of PDPs where they're using the protocol to basically have a two-way, whereas I tend to think of policies, we author them in Git and then push them to the PDPs. He was imagining a system more like a two-way system where the PDPs may act autonomously and themselves make commits up. But it was a very interesting vision of sort of maybe a more advanced way to use Git to create a signed trust network. But yeah, I agree with this 100%. The integrity and versioning is key to the decision log. You need to know what version of the policies were actually used at the time this was executed, or all bets are off. And there has to be cryptographic integrity there, or else you can't prove it in court. So
let's see, forensic grade time travel. So when was this hole opened or closed? And that's something else we get out of. That's great. That's the second very interesting, innovative Italian company I've heard of in IAM. So bookmark those folks. Thanks.
Yeah. So, but I'm agreeing with you 100% here. I despite the fact that glue, it really should be for glue. I think GitOps has really revolutionized the whole deployment.
I think by the time we're done, Mike, it's going to be glue ops.
Yes.
The other major trend in this A3Z in the last year or so has been NHI. NHI is an acronym that has moved about as fast as any acronym I've ever seen, short of LLM, non-human identity. Now, H is for humans because they command and use lots of devices, and we need to start tracking not just people, but the devices they use, the workloads they invoke. And there's a bunch of acronyms on this slide reminding us about not just the NHI working group and SPIFFE and Spire, but also new working groups like Whimsy, the workload integration for multi-system environments. It is the case that if you squint, humans and RPCs, the idea that OAuth and SPIFFE Spire may have something in common is I think extremely exciting, and AuthZen also speaks to that. But again, this is more of a quick survey of how many different ideas are out there in modern AuthZ in our little community here.
This is a big topic on the show, actually.
Yeah, I've been seeing some of your recent ones, Chris.
And I know a topic near and dear to your heart is we are going to have a lot of AI agents acting on behalf of people, not just IoT devices, but actually there's going to be more pieces of software than there will be humans.
Yeah, right.
So,
I mean, it's like saying at this point, I remember at some point calculating about 3 years ago, we passed the point where there are now more CMOS sensors than eyeballs on the planet. There'll be more than human senses. AI, intelligence, artificial at best, but superficial more often, right? I think that AI appears everywhere except for our productivity. The thing we might look for here is permissioned RAG, telling agents how to operate least privilege, because language models don't know what they're supposed to shut up about. They don't have a deep idea of secrecy or privacy or being able to know which information a certain questioner should have access to. And forgetting is really hard for them. So we can connect this problem, but I think that AI as a use case for authorization is really killer, and especially AI agents. Part 3, I have a bunch of thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think IIW, when I last saw you in person, there was numerous tracks talking about like impersonation chains and how you pass identity down through these agents, which calls another agent, which calls another agent. And there's some really interesting technical challenges there around how you do those token exchanges.
And there's some deeper moral challenges to what consent really means, right? I asked you to just find me a frequent flyer ticket to this climate conference. It meant maybe spend 100,000 miles. Didn't mean drain my account and donate it to a climate change charity. Right? Paperclip problems and alignment problems.
We're laughing, but this might actually happen.
Somebody else.
It won't be funny. Alex, actually, maybe you could say a word. You showed a cool demo at Demo Hour at IAW about integrating authorization. Maybe you could say a couple of words about that.
Yeah, so the way we're starting to see users kind of adopting these AI systems, primarily in an enterprise context at least, is the first port of call seems to be, let's go and get a chatbot, be it in Teams or Slack or some website, to enable, say, like the sales team to find out what the deal pipeline looks like and those sort of things, rather than having to click through a million screens in Salesforce or whatever. And the immediate challenge people kind of run into when they come to sort of finishing the POC and then, right, let's go and productionize this is, right, well, we're now a global organization and we need to make sure that we can make sure that the system, if the user is in Europe and they ask a question, they only get answers back based on the deals in Europe, or if they're in the US, they should only get the answers back from the central source in the US. And there's some challenges around how you can do that. One approach is you go and spin up a vector database in each region, which contains only the data for that region, but now you have to synchronize data to the right vector stores and those sort of things, or you can have one global score and have to overlay some filtering. And that's kind of what we see as the way that's being adopted. And so where authorization used to fit into this is when you then go off to go and query the vector store to go and find the similar or the related documents based on the user's sort of request or query, you need to overlay the filter. So there needs to be some mechanism where you can go off to your externalized authorization solution or your policy store or whatever you're using for that and say, hey, go and give me the conditions, go and give me the filters that I need to apply on top of this lookup and top of this similarity search in the vector store to ensure the documents that come back and then augmented inside of my query, retrieval augmented generation, are only the documents that this person that's asking the question, this identity that's asking the question, is allowed to see. And then you start locking down and constraining it. So it allows you to have that one single kind of vector store that contains all your business intelligence and sales deals or whatever kind of use case you're targeting, but then it's contextually filtering it based upon who the user prompting the system is. And that's such a key thing that you need to put in place from a frankly a regulatory, in a lot of cases, a setup that is going to sort of put a bit of a spanner in the works as more businesses are adopting these kind of AI systems. This needs to be thought about upfront and kind of integrated into the rest of your IAM strategy.
Glad to share more resources on that one too. There's a link to that talk of Alex's in the about 2 newsletter issues ago.
Okay. So this is from the AuthZ Substack.
Yeah.
That was from the AuthZ Substack.
Ahead of it too.
Right.
Yeah. I'll also just give you we don't need the JOTS. Looks like our audience here knows how JOTS work, but there's different accidents and problems with that. Things you should know about. The knowledge base, K is for the knowledge base I don't have.
Wait, can we go back to JOTS? Because we have Alex on, and he's the one person who I know that agrees with me on this one topic. There's been an argument. A lot of people, when they talk to me about AuthZ, they say, but where's the data coming from? And so in some cases, when you have autonomous microservices, we could argue that the JOT is the PIP. The JOT is the thing that's already gotten the data for you that now. I'm just curious, Alex, if you have any thoughts on the JOT as the PIP, and is that actually useful or is it enough data?
Yeah, so the JOT is obviously the first port of call you go for the identity. So the principal, the subject, whatever term you want to use. And a lot of time there'll be just enough context in that. So you might have some scopes or claims or roles or attributes to give you enough information the the information point for the identity. And that solves one part of the puzzle. The other piece you'll generally need also to make a decision is the actual resource that someone is accessing. The advantage of using like JOTs and making sure that you have just enough context in it, and I'm not saying run into a million role explosion and all that kind of problem that you run into, is the microservice, let's say, that's going to handle that request can just pass straight on that JOT to the underlying policy decision point, as well as the context about the resource. And the actual microservice itself doesn't need to understand how to go and fetch an identity, how to go and query LDAP or anything like that. It can be kind of dumb in that sense. And the only thing the call after the PDP needs to worry about is, okay, here's the JOT, here's the resource. Should this action be allowed based on the policy? So JOTs are a great way of kind of getting started and a way of sort of setting yourself up for success in terms of getting the identity piece done, and just saves a lot of headaches down the line. But obviously, everything's got a caveat. You kind of make sure that JOT doesn't get too big. You don't want to start blowing up headers and all sorts of fun stuff as well.
That's
Can I
part of
make
the
one more
caveat.
little point about JOTs
Yeah.
before we proceed? That developers sort of conflate JOTs. So that they'll say access token, ID token, user info token, software statement assertion.
Mhm.
They're all JOTs, but to developers, JOTs are this magical thing that conveys the authentication. Like Vittorio used to say, it's not just about mousse, it's chocolate mousse. But JOTs are really, it's like saying, oh, it's JSON. It doesn't really tell you a lot. And I see a lot of the challenges is that in the authorization space is that the people, the vendors and even the developers tend to conflate these JOTs. And I think that we need a more nuanced understanding of what an ID token means. It conveys the authentication event. What an access token means. It conveys a client authentication event. So it's both easier said, but also maybe more complicated. And how you map the information, especially if the JOT is sending you complex data, also presents challenges. So it's a sort of like, I know you wanted to skip right over this one, but it's actually such a critical piece. And this is another piece that wasn't in place, let's say 10 years ago, to convey a signed trusted JSON. Yes, we had XML. If you did XML canonicalization and all that other, but it just wasn't practical. But so the JOTs is a really big deal here.
As one of the authors in XML DSIG, I've seen exactly how hard it's been. That probably is your analogy to JSON's running. A JOT is just a postcard, right? It's digitally signed. What's on there is not it. Treating a postcard like a ticket to get into the golden ticket to the Willy Wonka factory is the mistake, right? A lot of the about saying, carelessness happen if you treat a JOT like a bearer token or a capability. They are not inherently that, right? And JOTs indeed are still a huge advance to have something that is postcard shaped that you can pass along between layers and hope arrives tamper proof. So yeah, fair point. That's why I made it in there. I wasn't sure what else to say about JOTs except that again they can be a vector for misunderstanding. A JOT inherently is just that postcard. So the problem is that as soon as you have a JOT and it says you have permission to do blah blah to 222, and you're like, I don't know what that foo method means. And we get to these knowledge bases. So you've been to permissions.cloud. It's a nice community service response, but it's just crawling and trying to chase after the cloud vendors to say, here are, I think, 20,000 some permissions across Azure, IAM, and Google Cloud, and what they might mean. And even then, you still can't do what people want to intuitively think, which is that, hey, I bucket.set tag permission. That means that I didn't give interns the ability to change the tags, right? Like, not quite. You were using your English language understanding of set tag. But in fact, there's a fourth parameter to create bucket, which is optional default initial tag, or there's something else that allows them to do it at a different level. This knowledge, is not very fresh, and it's certainly not something that you get directly from vendors. And I have high hopes that something more like a Policypedia should come up. I'll see in a second. Now, L is for languages, of which we have a babble so many, Alpha and XACML. I think many of these particular advocates have been on office hours. I look forward to hearing from a few more. And there's a lot of boundaries that are getting blurred because some policy engines can do multiple policy languages. Some policy languages can be translated to others. But I will say the most important thing to realize is that I take out of language here is that even if there were a lingua franca, there's no common interchange format for access control. Even if there was a Dropbox.rego or Dropbox.cedar, there's not an export format where you can go to Dropbox and say, please give me an output report, which is my company's entire Dropbox config in some machine readable access control format. So, just it's another reminder of like how early we are in this cycle. It seems kind of almost mind blowing to ask, like, I'd like to go to a SaaS vendor and get my logs, please. I'd like to go to a SaaS vendor at random and get their set of objects and users and permissions and get my current config in something I can go and commit to Git and have forensic access over. Not there yet. And now we're going to skip ahead a little faster. I know we're getting towards time here. I want to get to some of the fun speculative parts, but this for mandatory access controls. This is what they were in the beginning, max. But the things we use today where you can go in and change a setting are discretionary access controls, MAC versus DAC. And I don't want to have anyone, especially on the audio version, that's worried about saying, hey, you're missing some stuff on the slides here. But as you go through the alphabet, and we're wondering whether to commit to N for the North Star, which says, how are you architecting your entire authorization solution? Because if you borrow authorization open source library or sign up with a SaaS vendor solution to improve how you use your logic for your payroll or warehouse management application, what's your North Star that connects it to all the other authorization decisions going on in your company too? Because ultimately, there are other three-letter acronyms like governance, risk and control, and audit and compliance, and other teams that need this stuff. To me, we say P for policy, and P as policy as code. I would say the original sin of policy as code is that coders are the people who care least about the policies. Right? There's so many other stakeholders who are not coders who have a big influence on policy. And so having a North Star to say, how do we measure least privilege? Do we even measure in our company how many equivalent of root in cloud users are there? And are we quarter over quarter driving that number down of how many people have kind of root God access? These are some questions you should ask, right? So Q is for question. Interns do have access to production user data. And even before you try and roll out a new constitutional rule or mandate to say interns should never look at production user data, you should at least be able to ask questions before you go breaking the system with this new rule. And so these query systems, again, if you look at them, one of the exciting developments in our industry is that some of these policy language vendors are thinking about materialization and pre-qualifying these queries and realizing that to do this. But I always ask, everyone focuses on, hey, is my embedded authorization service going to be able to give me an answer within X microseconds or milliseconds at very high availability and very high nines, saying, can this method proceed? Can this user do this to that object? But do realize, I think one of the competitive differentiators in our industry is going to be how good is it at answering questions offline for the analyst? Like how many people could do this to that object?
Yeah, it's a fair point about there's a latency priority for the authorization decision, but there's also an authoring and a governance process that goes on with policies that's maybe separate from the core authorization task itself at runtime. And there are no easy answers for governance and policy authoring. And so we are really at the beginning of this journey.
I think even the word policy leads to confusion, because if you're more on the business side of things, you're thinking of like your SOC 2 policies that you've got as a business, and those are the kind of the business side of things that must be implemented. Then you look at someone that's maybe in an IM or a developer team, and they're thinking about literally like, can this action be called by this particular role? And there's that disconnect, and how you bridge that is so key to making sure that from the business side of things, they're thinking in terms of what the system needs to do, and the implementation side of things, and those things need a bridge between them to ensure that everyone's kind of on the same page and sort of working for the same hymn book.
Don't skip over OPA. I think OPA is important. My thought on OPA is they proved it was possible, because there had been a lot of attempts at authorization companies, but OPA found one specific segment, Kubernetes access control, and killed it in that segment, and is now expanding into other segments. But I think it is really a turning point for the authorization space when OPA starts to get adoption in a space that everyone thought that'll never get adoption for. I don't know. Alex, maybe what are your thoughts about OPA as someone in the industry? I'm sure you know well.
Yeah, I mean, so OPA and Policy Agent was really the thing, at least for me, made it sort of crystallize that this idea of policy-driven authorization, policy-driven way of permission models is firstly possible and also can be done sensibly. The actual nuts and bolts and how you work with like Rego and those sort of things, I think, is a very, very, very powerful tool, which also means it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. But in terms of the architecture, it has kind of driven and the acceptance of externalizing authorization and policy-driven authorization has been so key, and that whole project and ecosystem is built around it has done a lot of good, and essentially has created this entire industry, which ourselves and our peers are building around and building on top of in some cases.
Well, I mean, I do put a pin in this one. I mean, now at the next level above that, at the 400 level kind of grad student level debate here, there are questions about the language, though, right? Common expression language is great and fast for forward eval, but it is nowhere near as thought through for reverse eval and formal logic, because the moment you're able to go off and compute a function or call a helper or do a lookup, it becomes very hard to reverse it, right? That's what the Turing target, the halting problem. But we are, 41 saying that would be a great follow-up conversation sometime, maybe not me, but at some point, Mike would love to talk about the differences between languages, which is a shootout. But O is absolutely important that OPA has made it to a CNCF supported and widely embraced technology. It is, again, one of the few most important bright spots in how will SSO roll out. Eventually the SaaS revolution made that happen. How might policy externalized AuthZ roll out? It might be because of, DevSecOps for Kubernetes people kind of spreading from there. I'm very excited about that. Yeah. The other direction has been reback. R is for reback because that's been a case of introducing millions and arguably billions of users to a more subtle way of talking about access control from Google Docs, from social networking that they wish they had. And so now, even when doctors are dealing with a cancer testing portal, like when my wife works on there, they're bringing an intuition that says, hey, why can't I give owner, viewer, editor privileges to this group over here of other doctors on shift? They're doing reback and they're asking for traditional enterprise models might ask about. So this relationship-based stuff is another reason why people might finally throw in the towel and take a look at externalized AuthZ, is that externalized systems are more powerful and more easy to use and now easier to understand, kind of the consumerization of IT trend. Because the alternative has been just making more people admins and root, super users, S is for super user, who are heroes with clean stars on their shoulder. Cleany stars being those asterisks in a regular expression. They can match anything and I can run roughshod over the path. That's what I need. But the problem is that heroism, where you break glass and you take star and then you do fix the problem, not really helping the organization in the long term. They just show up in the audit logs as lots of cases of escalation and privileged access. Sometimes what we do instead is we use tags. T is for tags as a way to limit access. I said earlier, I keep going back to how to keep interns out of production user data. Well, one of the assumptions is that every production system is tagged and not tagged production or golden or public face or so on, right? So you get this question of tagging is often an entry point for conversations as identity and authorization architects with, I love that we're using tags as a feature of your policy language to have attribute-based access control. But who controls the tags? What are you doing to spell check all your tags in your enterprise? How do you know who can create a new tag? How do you make sure that things don't show up untagged and therefore ungoverned, right? So the cutesy quote on there for, again, on the podcast was that the original meaning of who will watch the watchman, quis ipsos custodets, is actually the longer quote is, who will guard the guards? Your wife knows and arranges accordingly. So in this case, Banksy knows and arranges how to retag things. All right, it's kind of vandalism. And didn't have a good U, but U as an OU, organizational unit, OUs and SCPs and high-level policies. There's a lot of things we've inherited from the world of LDAP and XY additional identity that may or may not make sense for developers, but they show that we need some notions of hierarchy. They need some way of saying, hey, this is the policy in this country and not in that other European country. This is the policy for our division and not another product division. But it's clear as mud.
I have a Banksy idea for your next year's talk. Do you know the painting that he did when they sold it? It's self-destructed.
Painting?
The shred one.
Yeah. Maybe there's an authorization metaphor there for some self-destroying data.
There you go. I mean, that's actually data on a string is what we need, which is data that can't be copied. If I trusted it, I'd share it with you.
Yeah.
Then really even zoom along here. I know we're on time here, but V is for verified permissions, possibly the most interesting product in Amazon's entire cloud portfolio. Like it says, as a non-Amazonian, that it is the Googliest product, and therefore I'm a little eyebrow raised still about it, right? Google might be a company more associated with like sharing esoteric computer science breakthroughs, but This is the one that clearly know how to do it, and they learned a lot from modeling and understanding their own IAM models. Even though there's no connection between AVP, Amazon Verified Permissions, and their own IAM, you can see throughout how many lessons and painful lessons learned are in that product. It's unique. I wish it were less unique on the market. W for Wiki, I think one of the projects I thought the newsletter might turn into yet. One of the things in our current survey for subscribers is, how do we make this more sustainable as a volunteer newsletter for next year? Maybe it should be more of a wiki, right? There should be a wiki with a Policypedia, or maybe that experience of policy as code for non-coders is that they should be able to go and edit a policy like they would Wikipedia. Interns, except in marketing, can not look at your data, right? Or in aggregate, right? Let me know if you have a good X. X here was like the query. X is the unbound variable. When you say who can do what with what, when you leave X, solve for X sort of problem.
I think you say X is where people have very strong opinions about authorization, but actually they're usually talking about authentication.
That's right. They're usually conflating problems they have with OAuth working. There.
Yep.
Y is for why, which is the most plaintive call of all. Because after every breach, they ask, why did they get in? How did this happen? And it's in fact incredibly hard to time travel right now. To say, just on the configurations we had last week, why did this happen? If we make this change, how many people last week would have been denied access? And do we want that to happen or not? These hypotheticals, the why questions are very hard to do. And finally, Z, of course, for Zen, the state with checks all in balance. And AuthZ is by far the most exciting single thing in the authorization industry in the past calendar year. It was one of the key markers for why this newsletter was created, why we think the startups and so on who are involved in this space when I come together to have a conference. Was why we wanted to have the newsletter as a way to kind of be a down payment towards creating this community in one place. But you've had several guests on talk about the progress with AuthZ, and I won't try to repeat that. I was really excited about it.
Well, we're making good progress. We're at Z.
Well, I was going to say, actually, here's we're going to do a time check with you. I mean, the remaining part is about 5.
Let's just keep going. This is a year-end episode. It's a super fun general interest topic. We're just going to let it run. Alex, how are you on time? You have another 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you
to the listeners for the generosity of their time.
So I'm available.
Yeah. Well, then I'll tack on about 10 more minutes here on what I think. Remember, I said A through Z. These are factual things. These are just clusters of issues that have occupied a lot of the issues of the newsletter throughout this year. And I think it's just kind of a tour of, hopefully, a pretty quick tour. Now, I also run a personal blog. It started the year with more New Year's resolution type energy of saying, hey, I'm going to talk about my thoughts on decentralized IAM on my own. And so here are some of the issues that I think are important, separate from what the newsletter as a community is finding important. One is that I think proofs are really important. So proving policies in CEDAR, I think that they can, as soon as you use language, we are at the precipice of a great opportunity in the industry. If we stick to things that you can logically analyze, then we can make useful, hard, constructive statements about the security of an entire enterprise, about know your customer, about anti-money laundering, and so on. And the critical issues are these things invertible. If you've ever actually looked at the formal logic of Amazon IAM, there's like 11 stages of evaluation. This thing.
And you wonder why there are so many corner cases, because there's a lot of corner cases. Yeah.
And so the fact that, there's some lessons learned in CEDAR, not just the fact that CEDAR is expressible in Lean as a backend and a theorem proving system, but that we should learn some lessons from how they've used Lean to do dynamic testing. So they create test cases, they can synthesize thousands more, and they continuously use regression. So one of the more recent posts from that research group has been how formal methods makes testing faster, right? So this current screen online is about how they used automated reasoning and differential testing to do fuzz testing more times per day. So not only do they have now the largest running implementation of formal verification kind of in any publicly documented place ever, using it billions of times per day, it means that they're able to use these formal traces and logic to make developers on their team more productive, because when you check in some code, they can formally prove whether it's still working or not. But I think the real opportunity is one that this last week's announcement at AWS begins to hint at, which is that formal logic is a level of math that's just almost too dangerous to ship on its own too, right? It's easy to paint yourself into a corner. And this dialogue, I'm going to take that after reading out loud, right? So again, imagine you say like interns shouldn't look at travelers' passports, right? Well, what does that mean? What's an intern? Where is this vision of a dialogue going to come true where you say, well, interns are people in that mailing list of interns, right? Well, what about test data, right? What about test data production? Well, okay, if the interns can't query any tables that have passport numbers in production systems. If there's a support case, so fine, they can only query tables that have PII, like passport numbers, from production systems when the manager approves, and there's evidence that that passenger is consenting, like they're having you debug an issue on the call center right now on the phone. This vision of using the best of LLMs and co-piloting, and yet still tying it back to formal logic, is probably the way forward. I wouldn't trust generative AI with synthesizing policy any more than I would with it taking code it spits and just immediately running it in a no-code environment. The danger is too high. But I think this three-way way of looking at it, where you use natural language coaching to translate into formal statements of invariance, use those to check your configuration, and then look at your configuration and summarize it back in natural language and say, hey, is this what you meant? Is going to be a very powerful meme. That's something I'd like to see explored more. Another thing that I'd worked on, as mentioned, was iambic. That was at one point a joke for IAM, but in code. Just because we have code languages like Terraform and Ansible, Chef Puppet, these things aren't necessarily the final form.
As a beer enthusiast, all I see is lambic. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds like a good sour beer.
I am also enthusiastic about those. Yes, that is an unfortunate sans serif capital I, is it not? And I hope the GitHub links are still up. But this idea
okay,
of,
I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So iambic and version control. Go ahead.
No, but the idea that, it should be possible. Like, again, I hope we'll look back on 2024, and I don't think it's a 2025 year-end prediction yet, but there's a great presentation on Maya K floating around on top 50 problems in interviewing CISOs, and one of the top three things she identifies as a problem for 2025 is that no one can get all their SaaS logs in one place and make sense of them. Right? You've got 200 SaaS apps. That means you've got may or may not even have all those logs in one place when there's an incident to go figure out what happened inside of Rippling or inside of a Workday or something. In that same vein, I think that having a way to a vision where you look back and say, yeah, remember back when you couldn't get a vendor to give you your security authorization layout policy, and you couldn't get a vendor to give you a standardized authorization log of all their decisions? I hope we can look back on that. And that vision of a policypedia. Maybe there's a new kind of UI for a policy administration point that looks more like a wiki, so you can trace rationales and how people did things and actually link things in your cloud security posture all the way back to your manuals and your disclosures that you're making in your SEC filings. Right? What Vanta and SecureFrame and Drata have done for SOC 2, I think is just, again, beginning of a deeper vision. A bunch of interesting vendors here too to look at. I think another thing is elasticity. So there's a concept of elastic authentication. So just because you logged in once with your name and password doesn't mean you're still you all the time. Maybe you put your laptop to sleep and you've now landed in China and now you've reopened it and logged in. Is it still the same device? Or you've been a virus that came out while you were in flight? So we have this shared signals framework from Kate to talk about whether you're maybe there's a shades of gray on how authenticated you are. And the moment you want to do a $50,000 transaction, you need to go touch your MFA again. Well, what about elastic authorization, right? Just because you are authorized to put another gigabyte of data into a S3 bucket may not mean that you have a rate limit because you've been spamming it. It may not mean you can afford it because you don't have any budget left in the billing. Maybe you can't actually get that extra terabyte of storage because they're out of capacity in that zone and in that region. Right? If you look at it from this way, I've been on the inside of the large cloud vendors, and obviously quota systems, billing systems, and authorization systems are all completely disparate. But the whole point of evolution and making computer developer experiences better, if you look at it this way, maybe those things align. The ability to commit an action is action dependent, not just on permission, but also on budget, also on justification. Elastic authorization is a concept I'm curious about. And finally, this is the biggest one I'm putting my most time and attention into is agentic AI, or decentralization for AI. An AI, how is it supposed to know when it imports information from a number of sources? Who should be able to see it? Kind of data with strings attached. Redactive, Gnostic, LangSafe, so many interesting new startups around this AI security, AI firewall space. That may be the killer app where maybe instead of, yes, a developer writes a new app and they need a login system, so they pick an auth-end vendor. And later on, they'll realize maybe by version 3 that they have spaghetti code about who is an admin and who can create a new book and who can change prices. And they say, maybe I should evaluate an AuthZ vendor. But maybe if you're doing RAG system, or retrieval augmented generation. Day one, I'm importing from 5 different legacy systems in my company. They have very sensitive billing and customer data. I need to actually have those rules be checked, and I don't have time, literally latency budget, to keep going back to SharePoint and asking it, can I show this? Can I show this? To maybe AI will be the driver that says, I need to have a single programming language to model how authorization decisions are made in hundreds of other systems.
I love how you picked SharePoint there as the world's slowest system.
I mean, the problem is SharePoint doesn't have a formal logic. I j'accuse, but I can't say one another. But I wonder if they ever did a project as big as Cedar for SharePoint and Active Directory, if they'd ever come back with things, or realize that 20 years of spaghetti code make it very hard to formalize.
Yeah.
I also think that we need a new kind of agent safety. This is the most hot off the presses thought I have. If I ask an agent to go try and book me a frequent flyer award ticket, I alluded to that earlier, I'd like it to do some logic and say, what's the least privilege that agent needs? That agent doesn't need to go in accounts and look at all my travel history. It doesn't need to look at my balance and spend 1 million miles on one ticket. I want it to be reasonable. But I realize that I don't have the time enough for that. Where's another role for an AI to put some guardrails in? So I want to read my mail and file my expense report. It doesn't mean I really want to have read-only access to everything in my Outbox, in my Outlook. I might want to have a concept like read-only for a label. And so how are these permissions going to get defined? Because these are permissions that may not exist in either system. So I need least privilege agents so I can actually safely run them. I think there's a huge kind of bear home with agent safety. And so, hey, here's the wrap up on where is this AuthZ market going, right? We have the standard Gartner hype cycle. And, I'd like to think that we have not yet even reached the peak of inflated expectations. We're still early on this curve. But are we going to be selling this to one app dev team at a time? We're going to find a way to sell and solve a critical board level problem for the CISO.
I would argue we're in the slope of enlightenment, actually.
I'm hoping you've
because
been long enough.
Yeah, I would say, because we had early like axiomatics in 2009. I would say they are sort of the peak, and then this is actually pretty hard. But I think we're clawing back up to this point where author externalize the idea that enterprises need to manage externalizes policies. I think that's mainstream now.
I hope so. That's what I'd say. Maybe that's we're trying to calibrate. Where are we on this time, and how can we speed run it once we do know where we are?
Yeah, what policy syntax is not, how to do it, how to manage policies. But I do think that we're through the trial of disillusionment. I don't think that anyone feels like, this whole authorization thing was a bad idea.
I think there's like an industry lens on top of this, though, because what we see is like the regulated industries, finance, banking, healthcare, etc., are much further along this. But the more, the broader base application set is much earlier on. And a number of conversations I've had where it's like, where were you like 2 years ago when we had to build this?
Good. That is awesome to hear.
So there is a lens to apply to this, I think.
That's true. I would say healthcare and financial services in particular, that's true for, and government a little bit. Although based upon, and telcos, apparently they haven't figured out that they even need to have any like access control behind the main entry point based on the current news.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the final slide I have, which is that healthcare is one of those markets. I really admire this kid, is Nikhil, is doing this thing called Out of Pocket. Different side of the generation gap, Ameliorated Silicon Valley, and has built himself up quite a brand, but it runs a very funny newsletter on the latest in healthcare software and healthcare IT. And merch. We don't have much merch for the AuthZ Substack, but these are posters that are the 6 stages of grief. We're going to make people healthier with AI, and we're going to go and make multiple $billions and replace the EHR, and eventually you end up at this disillusioned place of, I guess we're a services business that helps doctors, charge more insurance claims more quickly. But I think that wherever we are in that curve, I'm hopeful that you said we're getting towards here. I was afraid we might be here, but either way, I just enjoyed meeting so many people this year, and talking to you guys is a big part of that too. I just really appreciate the time the audience has taken to listen to this too, and of course, welcome everyone to please come by the newsletter, give us some feedback, figure out how we can do more to build a community around us.
Let's actually do some formal last thoughts. Alex, I'll give you like a minute of last thoughts for action items for the audience, and then Rahid, I'll give you the final words, and I'll announce a new episode. But Alex, that was a long time. Thank you for staying with us. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'll just end on, if you're not already thinking about externalized authorization, good chance you are if you're listening to this. It's something that you can put in early and then evolve with. Just don't necessarily have something that you have to wait and put in a big project later. You can start much earlier on it, and it will just unlock capabilities down the line. And I'll also make a pitch for AuthZ as the working group standards. Cerbos, we're part of that, trying to really move that along as a standard, so you can start demanding of your vendors that they support that approach. And if you are a application, you're a policy enforcement point, whether you're even another policy engine, please come and join the party. There's quite a bunch of us now, and the more the merrier, very much for that. But you can find out more about that on the OpenID working group, and you can find out more about Cerbos at cerbos.dev.
Rohit, last thoughts? Action items for the audience?
I think the most important action item is to try authorization and appreciate that every time you spread the word about AuthZ is the challenge after AuthN. Now we have our AuthN standards in place, we can talk about authorization. Please expand people's imaginations. Point them at authz.substack.com, or maybe we'll be renaming it soon. But the newsletter, please submit your links and give us some tips, and try to see if we can't create a real community, not just on the sidelines as we're doing with our meetups, things like the Gartner IM conference, but if you've got ideas of where we should meet or who might sponsor it, let's do that too. Let's create the patterns of a real industry, because we have to make this stuff simpler. Society is depending on a more cyber secure future, and simply saying that you didn't just steal credentials and log in falsely is only the beginning. It is everyone's obsession right now, but it's only the beginning, because once they're in and they have credentials, we need least privilege.
Okay, and if anyone out there doesn't know about the AuthZ Substack newsletter, please subscribe. And thank you, Rohit, it can be a thankless job for the AuthZ Substack team, but it's been great, and we appreciate being able to read that every week. And it doesn't happen without hard work, so thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
And okay, so let's wrap it here. Thank you, audience, if you stayed with us. Thank you, guests. Next week, we're going to actually do an episode on the Cedarling launch, which is a product we've been working on at the Janssen Project for some time. Wait, I have my announcement. And so I'm going to do a demo of it next week, and we'll see. The launch might be a little bit euphemistic. MVP might be more accurate, but we have been progressing, and we're excited to show you what we're doing. So next Tuesday. And with that, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. I'm very excited to see the launch. Thank you all.